Want to continue talking about the Beatitudes, and we're in Matthew chapter 5, and we're in the sixth Beatitude today. But I want to start with one of the most perhaps well-known passages from the Bible, going back to the book of Genesis. You hear it often in different circumstances, sometimes at weddings, and it is from Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, where it is said, God is speaking to the other members of the Godhead, "It is not good for man to be alone." And the reason I bring this verse up is because it's an interesting verse. It's a little bit of a strange verse when you think about how when we do get together, we so often make an awful mess of things. So it is not good for us to be alone, but it seems that when we get together that we don't do very well together. Holiday cards are very popular with the phrase peace on earth. Even while wars are going on around the world and corporations are building the technologies of war, politicians constantly are arguing and families squabble. And the first human ever to be born on this planet actually murders the next one, his brother. So Jesus comes along and he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Why is it so hard for us to live in peace with one another? This word that is behind our English phrase or term peace in Matthew 5:9 goes back to the Hebrew idea of shalom. Shalom is still a very popular, it's almost the equivalent of hello in the Middle East today, a greeting. In Hebrew, though, the word shalom suggests not only the absence of war, but the possibility of wholeness, of harmony, and prosperity. Shalom is life as it should be, and the world as it was created to be. And so shalom is much bigger than the absence of interpersonal conflict. But interpersonal conflict has a really good way of messing up our sense of overall well-being. So this idea of making peace usually means resolving conflict between two parties. You are a peacemaker if you reconcile parties that are in conflict. Peacemakers, Jesus says, are children of God, because peacemaking is something that God is very interested in. In considering God's work in the world, Paul makes peacemaking the major theme. If you want an outline of the book of Ephesians, it is all focused on peace. So Ephesians chapter 1 Paul talks about how God has made peace between himself and humanity. In the second chapter of Ephesians, talks about how Christ has broken down the dividing wall, how there is now peace between Jew and Gentile. That's chapters 2 and 3. Ephesians chapter 4 is about peace among believers. And the 5th and 6th chapters of Ephesians kind of focusing on peace in the home, peace in the family. And so it only makes sense that if we want to reflect God, then making peace is probably a good practice to achieve, to follow. Jesus reached out to connect with people who were typically disparaged and treated as outsiders. Jesus aroused controversy in associating with tax collectors and others who were labeled as sinners. He welcomed children who were thought to be of less importance than adults. And in a culture where women were devalued, Jesus treated them with respect and equality. He touched unclean people, those with diseases who were believed to be contagious. He even engaged with Roman soldiers, the despised foreign oppressors of the day. And this is what we see in Jesus pursuing peace. So the reality is that we're all sons and daughters of God, members of one human family. We belong to one another. There are no sides. And those who understand this become peacemakers. A couple of weeks ago, when I was talking about mercy, I encouraged us to look at others through heart-shaped hands. And in terms of today's beatitude of peacemaking, imagine your arms stretched out in an embrace and linking your fingers together in a symbolic posture of reaching past differences. What practices might move us from dividing to embracing one another? Maybe the place that we need to begin peacemaking is the hardest, and that is in our personal relationships, our closest relationships. Jesus later on in the Sermon on the Mount will talk about how if your brother or your sister has something against you, you are to drop what you're doing and to go and be reconciled to them. Matthew 6, verses 23 and 24. So how do I know? How do I know if I need to make peace? Maybe one sure sign is if a certain person walks into the room or their name comes up in a conversation, you feel a tightening in your stomach, or maybe in your head, or maybe in your chest. But if you're going to have any hope of making peace, you're going to have to learn to de-escalate. Excuse me. You're going to have to learn how to calm that, what some people call the emotional side of your brain, or the emotional brain down, and let the rational brain take charge. Because what the emotional brain wants so often is not what makes for shalom. The emotional brain often wants to plaster over conflict rather than try to resolve it. It knows how to keep the peace, and which is not exactly the same as making peace, right? Emotional brain says, don't rock the boat, put on a happy face, pretend everything is fine, don't acknowledge anything that might not be okay. But that means that the underlying issues that have caused conflict are still there. They are, somebody has said they're like zombies. And burying them doesn't kill them. They just, they'll be back. And that tactic may get you some quiet, may get you some peace, so to speak, but it really won't get you peace. The other thing is that sometimes we want to win. We want to win any kind of disagreement or conflict. And that's why action movies never end with a big diplomatic breakthrough where everybody is just embracing at the end. That's not what we want. We want the punch to the face. We want to prove a point. We want, and we just find that very satisfying, except it's completely useless. The person we're in conflict with is going through the same thing, right? They also want to win. And so aiming to win just makes it a zero-sum game that everyone is sure to lose. And this idea of a decisive win in an interpersonal conflict is a total con that our emotional brain is selling us. We're trying to impress an audience that is entirely in our own heart. We're so concerned with what the imaginary audience thinks that we're not listening. Active listening is hard. I am not I am not an expert at it. I don't. I'm not saying that I do it well, but it is an effective way to de-escalate the situation, the other person, so we can look for ways that we can both win, so to speak. And that's pretty much the opposite of what our emotional brain wants. So it means that we ignore that zinger that our emotional brain is trying to put together. We ignore that knockout punch that we think we can land on the other person. Active listening means silencing the noise, listening not just with your ears, but with every sense that you have, every cell in your body. It means listening to all that is said and unsaid, to the body language, the tone, the eye movement, all of that. This type of listening can build trust, can open doors, it can offer a path to deeper relationships and a connection that can form the basis of new understandings and new possibilities. Excuse me. Study after study shows in all sorts of areas of life, in medicine, in marriage, in sales, and all different sectors, that active listening generates better results. And yet, let me confess, I go through, and I haven't really learned how to do that. And it is something that I need to actively pursue. The other thing about the emotional brain is that we like to draw a line between us and them. And so when we encounter differences, the easiest thing is to caricature the other person's perspective, to withdraw from, to simply keep pushing our views. The media knows this very well. They know that the best way to get the clicks, to attract the eyeballs, to get the revenue, is to manufacture conflict, alarm, controversy. And if you want to see how pervasive that mentality is, just try going a day or a week without using language that labels, that stereotypes, that divides. Labels like, well, they're liberal, or he's conservative, or he's a Christian, or she's an atheist. And see how that, avoiding that kind of language, that us and them, shapes your heart, shapes your interactions, maybe in new ways. One term for this is what they call othering. And whether it's an altercation at the grocery store or a dispute between nations, we come up with a way to view them as being less them. And when it's them versus us, we can pretty much justify anything that we decide to do. And our decisions will be totally unconcerned with peace. None of this is like God. God in no way minimizes or ignores the rift between us and him, but instead of being concerned with winning, Jesus was willing to go to the cross. And through the cross, Jesus, as I mentioned that passage in Galatians chapter 3, he breaks down the dividing walls between us and them. So do we want to be peacemakers? If we're going to try to put this beatitude into practice, then we're going to need to remember that in the very covenant that set the Israelites apart, that proclaimed that they were God's chosen people. God, interestingly, and you find this in Deuteronomy 10, verse 19, he commands them not to treat the foreigners among them any differently. They were the same. There was to be no us and them in Israel. And so when you get up from your seat and go introduce yourself to someone who is from a totally different background than you are, maybe from another culture, then you are being a peacemaker. When you invite an international student to come to your home for supper, you're being a peacemaker. And let me say this, when you're from another culture and you tough it out in a predominantly white Canadian church, patiently helping to bring down the barriers, increasing our understanding of different cultures, you are engaged in the hard work of peacemaking. Jesus' words certainly have implications for the world stage. But I think the primary context for peacemaking is in the realm of our personal relationships. Our arena is not the United Nations. Our arena, first and foremost, is the church, our relationships. The Apostle Paul echoes Jesus's command when he says, "Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." Notice the tools of a peacemaker that Paul lists in these verses. Humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another. You see, there's more to making peace than simply being a skilled negotiator. How do we keep our differences from becoming toxic? Well, we're invited to give up that need that we feel to win, to be right. We're invited to step out of our echo chambers and to do some active listening. And it takes tenacity. It takes tenacity to stay engaged across differences, to focus on communities, to be humble, to be curious, to say, maybe I don't know everything about this situation. I may be wrong. To listen, to seek to understand somebody else's experience, perspective, desires. When there's desire, when there's a difference or conflict, someone has to go first. Someone has to have the courage to initialize contact and to seek peace. Someone has to reach out with hands embraced to be a peacemaker. And this beatitude invites us, to move from dividing to embracing. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And this is the kingdom breaking through. This is making things the way they should be. Shalom. And as we learn to speak the language of heaven, The scarred and marred image of God can be healed, can be restored. And the more the image of God is restored, the more the work of partnering in creation extends outside of us. To a world that is marred by conflict, we can help in a small way by bringing shalom. We can become peacemakers. We can become children of God. Let me conclude. May God grant you the vision, the strength, and the courage to proclaim God's message of peace, whether welcome or unwelcome, for the sake of God's beloved children. May God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.